Picture this. You're sitting down to what you don't know will be your last meal. The food tastes different somehow. Maybe it's the poison slowly coursing through your veins. Maybe it's the knowledge that in just hours, everything will end. Throughout history, some of the world's most powerful people had faced this exact moment. Kings who ruled empires, leaders who shaped nations, celebrities who captured hearts, all reduced to their final, often horrifying, last bites. What you're about to discover will change how you think about food, power, and death forever. Because these aren't just stories about famous people dying. These are tales of betrayal served on silver platters, of last wishes denied, and of meals that became weapons. Some of these final meals were chosen, others were forced, and a few, well, they might not have been meals at all. Let's begin in ancient Rome, where power and paranoia went hand in hand like wine and bread. The year is 54 AD, and Emperor Claudius is about to discover that sometimes the people closest to you are the most dangerous. Claudius wasn't supposed to be emperor. He was the stammering, limping nephew who everyone overlooked. But when Caligula was assassinated, suddenly, this unlikely man found himself ruling the greatest empire on earth. For 13 years. He proved everyone wrong, conquering Britain and building magnificent structures. But his fourth wife, Agrippina, had different plans. On that fateful October evening, Claudius sat down to what he thought was just another dinner with his beloved wife. The main course, his favorite dish, mushrooms. Fresh, delicious mushrooms that Agrippina had personally selected. But these weren't ordinary fungi. According to the Roman historian Tacitus, Agrippina had enlisted a professional poisoner named Locusta, who specialized in making death look like dinner. The mushrooms were laced with a deadly toxin, possibly from the death cap mushroom, nature's perfect assassin. Death caps look remarkably similar to edible mushrooms, but contain enough poison to kill a grown man. As Claudius enjoyed what he believed was a loving gesture from his wife, the poison began its work. But here's where the story gets truly horrifying. The poison worked too slowly for Agrippina's liking. As Claudius began to feel ill, she called for the royal physician, Xenophon. Instead of helping, Xenophon dipped a feather in more poison and supposedly tickled Claudius's throat, claiming he was helping him vomit. The second dose finished what the mushrooms had started. Why did Agrippina do it? She wanted her son Nero to become emperor, and her plan worked. Nero took the throne at just 16 years old, and we all know how that story ended. But imagine Claudius in those final moments, realizing that the woman he loved had served him death disguised as dinner. The man who conquered Britain was conquered by a plate of mushrooms. Fast forward 12 centuries to medieval England, where another ruler would meet his end through food, though in a way that's both more gruesome and more mysterious than you might expect. King John of England was not a popular king. He was cruel, paranoid, and had managed to anger just about everyone in his kingdom. By 1216, his own barons had forced him to sign the Magna Carta, and civil war was tearing England apart. But it wasn't a sword or an arrow that would end King John's reign. It was something far more intimate and disturbing. In October 1216, King John was traveling through the marshy lands of East Anglia when he stopped at Swineshead Abbey. The monks offered him hospitality, as was customary for traveling royalty. But according to some accounts, this hospitality came with a deadly twist. The most widely accepted version of John's death involves severe dysentery, likely caused by contaminated food or water. But there's a darker tale that has persisted through the centuries. Some chroniclers claimed that a monk at Swineshead Abbey, driven by hatred for the king's cruelty, deliberately poisoned John's ale with a substance that would cause excruciating internal agony. The supposed poisoner was said to have declared he would gladly sacrifice his own life to rid England of this tyrant. And if the story is true, he got his wish. Both he and the king died that night, though John's death was far more prolonged and agonizing. What we know for certain is that King John became violently ill after eating at the abbey. For days, he suffered from severe stomach pains, fever, and what medieval chroniclers delicately called a flux of the bowels. He was in such agony that he had to be carried on a litter as his party continued traveling. John died 9 days later at Newark Castle, and with him died the last hope of absolute royal power in England. His death paved the way for his 9-year-old son, Henry III, to take the throne, under the guidance of more moderate regents who honored the Magna Carta. But here's what makes this story particularly chilling. Whether it was poison or disease, King John spent his final days knowing that something he had consumed was killing him from the inside. Every meal, every sip of water became a potential enemy. Trust, it seems, was a luxury medieval kings couldn't afford. Let's travel to revolutionary France, where the most famous queen in history was about to face her final dawn. Marie Antoinette had gone from being the glamorous Queen of France to prisoner number 280 in the Conciergerie prison. Her husband, King Louis XVI, was already dead, executed by guillotine 9 months earlier. Now it was her turn. October 16th, 1793, Marie Antoinette woke in her cold, damp cell, knowing this would be her last morning on Earth. But what many people don't know is the heartbreaking detail of what she was offered for her final meal, and what she couldn't bring herself to eat. Her jailers brought her a simple breakfast, some bread, a small portion of soup, and weak coffee. Nothing like the elaborate pastries and delicate foods she had once. It wasn't just fear that stole her appetite, it was illness. The former queen was suffering from what we now know was likely uterine cancer, causing her constant pain and internal bleeding. She was also dealing with severe depression and what we would today recognize as trauma from months of imprisonment and the loss of her husband. But here's the detail that makes this story particularly tragic. Among her few remaining possessions was a small locket containing a miniature portrait of her children. As she sat with her untouched breakfast, she clutched this locket, knowing she would never see her surviving children again. The woman who had once been criticized for her lavish lifestyle couldn't even finish a piece of bread. Her final meal consisted of little more than a few swallows of bitter coffee, bitter in more ways than one. What makes Marie Antoinette's final breakfast even more poignant is what happened next. She was taken from her cell, had her hands bound, and was paraded through the streets of Paris in a simple cart. The crowd that had once bowed to her now jeered and spat. And through it all, that unfinished piece of bread sat in her cell, a symbol of how far she had fallen. Some historians argue that Marie Antoinette was more a victim of circumstances than the villain she was painted to be. She was just 14 when she arrived in France, thrust into a world of political intrigue she never fully understood. Her final breakfast, barely touched, barely acknowledged, seems to reflect a life that ended before she could truly live it. Now we jump to one of history's most dramatic betrayals, where friendship and food became weapons in the hands of ambitious men. The place is Rome. The year is 44 BC, and Julius Caesar is about to learn that sometimes your closest allies can be your deadliest enemies. But Caesar's story isn't just about the famous assassination on the Ides of March. It's about what happened the night before, a dinner party that would be his last, hosted by one of the very men who planned to kill him. On the evening of March 14th, Caesar dined at the home of Marcus Lepidus, one of his trusted allies. But also present at this dinner was Marcus Junius Brutus, Caesar's adopted son, and unknown to Caesar, one of the leaders of the conspiracy against him. Imagine the scene. Caesar, relaxed and jovial, sharing wine and conversation with the men who had already decided his fate. The irony is almost unbearable. According to historical accounts, the dinner conversation actually turned to the topic of death. Someone asked what kind of death was preferable, and Caesar himself answered, a sudden one. Within hours, he would get exactly what he had wished for. But here's where the story becomes truly chilling. Brutus and the other conspirators had to sit through that entire meal, making small talk, laughing at Caesar's jokes, all while knowing they would murder him the next day. They had to look into the eyes of the man who trusted them, who had shown them favor and friendship, and pretend everything was normal. Caesar's final meal wasn't poisoned like Claudius's mushrooms, or barely touched like Marie Antoinette's bread. It was a full, elaborate Roman feast shared with friends and family. He drank wine with the men who would spill his blood. He broke bread with those who would break their oaths to him. The next morning, Caesar almost didn't go to the Senate meeting. His wife Calpurnia had dreamed of his death and begged him to stay home. But Brutus came to Caesar's house personally to convince him to attend, arguing that the Senate was waiting to offer him important honors. So, Caesar, trusting his son, went to his death. And as the daggers found their mark, Caesar saw Brutus among his assassins and spoke those legendary words, "Et tu, Brute." You too, Brutus. The man who had shared his final dinner had helped serve his death. In ancient Rome, sharing a meal was sacred. It created bonds of trust and friendship. Brutus didn't just betray Caesar. He violated one of the deepest social contracts of their civilization. Let's leap forward to the 20th century, to a story that shows how food and medicine can become indistinguishable from poison when placed in the wrong hands. Our subject is one of the most iconic figures in entertainment history, whose final meal might not have been a meal at all. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, died on August 16, 1977, at his Graceland mansion in Memphis, Tennessee. But the circumstances surrounding his final hours and what he consumed remain one of music history's most debated mysteries. On the night before his death, Elvis was unusually restless. He had been battling insomnia, chronic pain, and a dangerous dependence on prescription medications. His regular doctor, George Nicolopoulos, had been prescribing him a cocktail of drugs that would have killed most people: painkillers, sedatives, stimulants, all mixed together in a deadly pharmaceutical soup. But Elvis's last meal wasn't the famous peanut butter, banana, and bacon sandwiches he loved. According to his girlfriend, Ginger Alden, his final food was 4 scoops of ice cream and 6 chocolate chip cookies, consumed around 10:30 p.m. on August 15th. Simple, innocent, almost childlike, a stark contrast to what would happen next. After this modest snack, Elvis took what he called his medication. But these weren't normal pills. Dr. Nick, as Nichopoulos was known, had prepared what he called attack packets, pre-measured doses of multiple drugs designed to help Elvis sleep, manage pain, and wake up the next day. That night's packet contained a lethal combination: codeine, morphine, quaaludes, Valium, and several other depressants. It was essentially a suicide pill disguised as medicine. Elvis swallowed this chemical cocktail like it was vitamins, trusting the doctor who had been slowly killing him for years. But here's where the story gets truly disturbing. Elvis didn't die peacefully in his sleep, as many believe. He was found hours later on his bathroom floor, having suffered what appears to have been a massive heart attack brought on by the drug overdose. His body had essentially shut down from the toxic overload. The 4 scoops of ice cream and 6 cookies were the last normal things Elvis put in his body. Everything after that was poison masquerading as medicine, served by a doctor who prioritized Elvis's dependency over his health. What makes this story particularly tragic is that Elvis knew something was wrong. In his final months, he had repeatedly expressed worry about his health and his drug use. But the people around him, including Dr. Nicopolis, enabled his addiction rather than treating it. Elvis's death certificate lists cardiac arrhythmia as the cause of death, but the real killer was polypharmacy, death by multiple drugs. His final meal of ice cream and cookies was innocent enough, but it was followed by a pharmaceutical feast that no human body could survive. The king of rock and roll didn't die from rock and roll excess. He died from trusting the wrong people with his life. People who served him death in pill bottles instead of helping him find healing. Our final story takes us back to ancient Athens, to a death that was both a meal and a statement, both an ending and a beginning. This is the story of Socrates, the father of Western philosophy, whose final drink would become one of history's most famous final meals. The year was 399 BC, and Socrates had been condemned to death by the Athenian court for corrupting the youth and introducing new gods. At 70 years old, he could have fled Athens, could have begged for mercy, could have remained silent. Instead, he chose to face his sentence with the same courage and curiosity that had defined his life. The method of execution was uniquely Athenian and in many ways almost civilized compared to other ancient punishments. Socrates would drink a cup of hemlock, a poison derived from a plant that causes gradual paralysis and death. But what makes Socrates' final meal unique is that he treated it as both a philosophical lesson and a social occasion. According to his student Plato, who recorded the event in vivid detail, Socrates spent his final day surrounded by friends and disciples, discussing the nature of death and the immortality of the soul. As the sun set, the executioner arrived with the cup of hemlock. But instead of drinking immediately, Socrates continued talking, comforting his weeping friends, and even joking about the situation. When told he must drink before full darkness, he calmly asked if he could pour a libation to the gods. The executioner said there was only enough poison for 1 dose. Socrates then took the cup and, according to Plato, without trembling, without any change of color or expression, but looking at the man with wide-open eyes, drank the hemlock as easily as if it were wine. But the hemlock wasn't fast-acting. Socrates had time to walk around, to feel the poison slowly paralyzing his legs, to lie down and continue talking with his friends. His last words were about a debt he owed to the god of healing. Credo, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Please don't forget to pay the debt. Even in death, Socrates was thinking about his responsibilities to others. His final meal, the cup of hemlock, wasn't consumed in fear or anger, but with the same intellectual curiosity that had driven his entire life. He approached death as he approached everything else, as a problem to be examined, a mystery to be explored. What makes Socrates' death particularly powerful is that it was entirely voluntary. He could have escaped, but he chose to honor Athens' laws even when those laws condemned him unjustly. His final drink wasn't just poison. It was a statement about integrity, about the importance of living and dying according to your principles. These stories span over 2,000 years and 6 very different lives, but they all share something profound. They remind us that in our final moments, we are all reduced to the most basic human experiences. We all need food. We all need trust. We all face the mystery of death. Emperor Claudius learned that love could be a lie served on a silver platter. King John discovered that power couldn't protect him from the contents of a simple cup. Marie Antoinette found that wealth meant nothing when you couldn't swallow a piece of bread. Julius Caesar realized that friendship could be as sharp as any dagger. Elvis Presley trusted the wrong people with pills that promised healing but delivered death. And Socrates showed us that even poison can be consumed with dignity when you understand what you're dying for. Each of these final meals tells us something about how we live, how we trust, and how we face our mortality. They remind us that the powerful are just as vulnerable as anyone else, that our final moments often reflect the choices we've made throughout our lives. The next time you sit down for a meal, remember these stories. Remember that food is never just fuel. It's trust, it's love, it's sometimes betrayal, and it's always in some way a choice. Because in the end, we all face that final bite, that last sip, that moment when eating becomes a memory. What will your final meal say about the life you lived?